And joining us now is Rinaldo Walcott. He is Canada Research Chair in Social Justice and Cultural Studies at OISE, the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. Welcome back to TVO.
Thank you for having me back.
Particularly on a day like today where we've got such an exciting story to talk about. A black man has been elected President of the United States, not Prime Minister of Canada. You as a Canadian, I'm interested in your take on the fact that there's going to be a black man as the head of that country.
I'm extremely excited. It's extremely overwhelming. I have to say that I went to bed feeling one way and woke up feeling another. I feel like a different kind of person today.
Okay, how did you feel last night?
Last night I was just euphoric. It was a euphoric moment last night. But once I went to bed and I woke up this morning and I realized that it really did happen, it wasn't the dream, I felt like a different person. This win, in some senses, is a certain kind of vindication for black people around the world. You know, the last 400 years of black life on this earth has not been easy. So to see a black man be president-elect of the most powerful capitalist and democratic country in the world is truly special.
Let's go back. When Barack Obama was running for the White House, when he first emerged on the scene, what did you think of him?
When he first emerged on the scene, I was very ambivalent about him. I was not sure whether or not he made sense in the context of U.S. politics because he didn't come from that long generations of African-American people who were enslaved. You know, he is the son of an immigrant and a white mother from Kansas. So I was ambivalent because there wasn't a lot of meat to the kinds of policies that he was suggesting would be the foundations of his campaign.
Yeah, the narrative was not exactly Martin Luther King, was it?
No, it wasn't Martin Luther King, but it wasn't, most importantly, it didn't initially seem as an extension of Martin Luther King because African Americans and black people worldwide can't just be stuck at Martin Luther King. King had to be extended, and initially we didn't see that.
And when he secured the nomination, what did you think at that point?
Well, by the time the nomination process went on, it was very clear that he was going to extend the dream of Martin Luther King, that not just that he was going to extend it, that he was going to write a new version of it. And so as the nomination process went on and it became quite heatedly and bitterly contested, it was very clear what kind of person we were witnessing. And he is an inspirational figure, there's no doubt about that.
So members of the black communities in this city, this province, this country, do you think they are taking as much pride out of his victory as Americans are?
I'm pretty sure that they are. I'm sure that black people across the globe are taking a great deal of satisfaction and a great deal of vindication, especially black Canadians.
What if he had lost? What would that have meant to you?
If he had lost, he would have still won. But if he had lost, it would have been devastating to have come so close and not to, as they kept saying throughout the primary, close the deal. But nonetheless, if he had lost this election, it would have still have been a tremendous win. The ways in which he extended and rewrote the civil rights narrative from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the kind of coalition that he's been able to build with women, young people, minority voters, it's a tremendous electoral and democratic achievement. And the fact that this man in 2 years built a billion-dollar organization should not be lost on any of us. It speaks to the talent of the man.
Let's talk more about the black experience then, Rinaldo. Do you think, well, others have observed, and I wonder if you agree, that in order to win, Barack Obama played down his blackness. Do you think that's true?
I think the answer to that is yes and no. I'm ambivalent about the notion that he played down his blackness. I think that blackness comes in many, many different forms and many different kinds of practices. So, Barack Obama offered us another version of what blackness can be, is, and can aspire to be. On the other hand, I do understand why some people make the claim that he played down his blackness. Because clearly there's a particular idea about blackness in North America where black men become imperiled and they become dangerous and they become a threat. And so if one is going to move into the mainstream of politics in the way that Obama has now accomplished, one has to be fully aware of that other narrative of what it means to be a black man in North America and to mediate against it.
I know you'll forgive me for this observation because we know each other reasonably well, but you know, this is a guy with a white mother. This is a guy who was raised by white grandparents. It's a guy who grew up in Hawaii, right? He doesn't look like you. Could he have won the presidency if he'd looked more like you?
I think on the morning after, I will have to say, yes, it's possible. But I would have to temper that. He might have a white mother. He might have been raised by his white grandparents. But the rules of race in North America, regardless of how he himself might think of himself, sees him and marks him as a black man.
So when people say this is a post-racial moment for America, you say what?
I say this might be a post-racial moment for Barack Obama as an individual person. But I still think that we have to grapple with the ways in which race and racism will continue to shape the lives of especially poor black people in urban areas, especially in North America.
Because their situation, despite the fact the president is black, hasn't changed, has it?
It hasn't changed, and it's pretty dire, and it's going to have to be addressed quite seriously if we can even begin to talk about post-racial society.
We've invited you here today because we're most interested in your particular take on the experience in the black communities in Canada compared to what we've been hearing in the United States. How different is the Canadian black experience from the American one?
Well, I think it's very, very different, and it's also very, very similar. So, for instance, in the U.S. context, there is a sense of a national African American community. There's a narrative that black people in that nation come into as a way of creating a national community. In the Canadian context, there's not a national black community. There are different black communities, and sometimes we come together as a community in response to questions of racism, maybe questions around education and so forth. But we don't have the same kind of overreaching narrative that African Americans have in Canada among black people. And that's a real important and fundamental difference.
Now, what's your heritage, if I can ask?
I was born in Barbados.
In Barbados. Okay. Now, his father is from Kenya. Yeah. So, I mean, that's those two places, yes, the people have the same skin color for the most part, but they're a long way apart. Mm-hmm. Can I infer from that that there's not as much in common as perhaps, you know, white Canadians or Americans might think?
Well, I think there is and there isn't. It depends upon the commonalities happen and occur, depending on where people meet. So, for instance, you get the story of a man like Barack Obama, whose father was an immigrant to the U.S., and now today, November 5th, he's the president-elect of the U.S. We get the contemporary story of Canada as one that is written and rewritten as a story of this country as being a country of immigrants. And yet, we can't think of a black child of an immigrant in this country who could be reaching across any institution in the Canadian context to the kinds of heights and aspirations that Barack Obama has just achieved. So it tells you something about the different narratives of the two nations, the kinds of founding myths that the two nations have and that people come into.
No, I hear you, but that's not our Achilles. If you don't mind my saying, I don't think the experiences of the black community is necessarily this country's Achilles heel. It's the Aboriginals, the First Nations.
Well, I think it's both. I mean, black people have been in Canada since the 1600s, and yet people talk about black people in this country as though we just arrived post-1960.
Well, that's a fair point.
And we have to continually point out to people every year at February in this country that no, black people have a very long and solid relationship to Canada before Canada was Canada and at the time of Confederation. So in some ways, both the Aboriginal and the black story is a part of Canada's Achilles heel.
Many people pointed to that speech that Mr. Obama gave about Reverend Wright as one of the real telling moments of the campaign where he tried to open up a dialogue between white and black America about race. Are we having that kind of an honest conversation among the races in this country?
I don't think we're having it at all. I think we need to have it, and I'm hoping that part of the symbol of Barack Obama's achievement will allow us to have it. It's absolutely imperative that as the demographics of Canada change from Canada imagining itself as a white nation to being something else, that we need to talk about the ways in which race and racism work in our nation.
We've got a black governor general now, though, and it is not uncommon to see. What do you prefer, African Canadian or blacks, or what's your preferred?
I move back and forth between black Canadian and African Canadian.
Okay, but it's not extraordinary to see blacks in high places in this country anymore. So why aren't we having that conversation here?
Well, I do think that it is still somewhat extraordinary to see blacks in high places in this country. It's true that we have a black governor general, and it's true that we talk about Lincoln Alexander as being the first black MP, and it's true that we've had Howard McCurdy in the NDP and the late Rosemary Brown and so forth, but it's a small number.
It's a short list, you're right.
It's a very short list, and it's never sustained. This is the problem, and this is where I think the profound effects of racism work in Canada. That is not sustained, that these achievements are not sustained. I want to see, lots of black surgeons and black presidents of universities and colleges and black CEOs and black vice presidents of Toronto Dominion Bank and so forth and whatnot. That's what I would like to see. That's what I would like to see us having a conversation about. I would like us to see black people in this country being a part of the vision of a future Canada. I don't think that we have those kinds of conversations and that we have the opportunity to participate in those kinds of conversations on a regular basis.
As opposed to just baseball players or football players or basketball players
Exactly.
or rappers or whatever.
Yes.
Yeah. Incidentally, we're going to do much of the program tomorrow night on this very topic, whether Canada could create a Barack Obama. You say no, and we're going to get into that tomorrow night some more.
I don't necessarily say no. I just don't think that right now we have the conditions in this country to produce that person.
Canada is, of course, we always say this, we're a country of immigrants. Except for the First Nations, we're a country of immigrants. How does you touched on this a second ago, but go into it some more if you would. How does Canada's, the history of blacks in this country fit into that narrative?
Well, it's a real paradox because on the one hand, clearly the majority of black people in this country right now come from some kind of immigrant lineage. But each time that we uphold that as the beginning and the end of the story for black people in this country, what we do is we display 7th and 8th generation black Nova Scotians, black Ontarians, and we have to be able to grapple with the fact that if black people have been in this country since the 1600s, how is it that we don't know the names, that it's not a part of our Canadian popular historical memory to be able to roll off of our tongues the names of important people, both then to a black Canadian tradition and Canadians more generally. So I think of, people like Matthew da Costa, who was among Champlain's adventurers and was reportedly a translator between the French and the Aboriginal people. I think of Oliver Lejeune. I think of Marie-Joseph Angelique. I think of Lucien Thornton Blackburn. There are a list of people that all of us in Canada, not just black people, should be aware of, that should act as symbols towards something more, and yet they don't really exist.
Why don't we know these names?
Well, I think that there's a way in which, the racism that organizes black and white life in Canada and other people of color life as well, but we're talking about black people today, is a particular kind of perverse and deep-seated racism that often we lack the language for pointing to it and pointing to the way in which it works to make these things disappear and only appear in very, very small and tiny moments.
Is it because the majority culture isn't interested in your story?
I don't think it's so much that the majority culture is not interested in the story. I think the majority culture has been given and have come to believe a different kind of story, and it's that story of the recent arrival and that story of a post-1960s immigrant narrative, where now that we have the children of those immigrants being born in this country, even those children are misrecognized as Canadian.
Did you teach a class today? Did you see any students today? That's what I'm getting at.
I'm on sabbatical.
Oh, you're on sabbatical, okay. Because I'm just trying to imagine what 18, 19, 20-year-old, 21-year-old students, African-Canadian kids, would think about what they saw last night.
Well, from my experience and from my nephew, I would have to say that they're jubilant. I would have to say that they are thinking about what new possibilities this might open up for them in Canada as well. So I think that, the symbolism of Barack Obama is going to be extremely powerful for black Canadian youth in particular. So the possibilities, I think, are endless if we can have honest conversations about black life in Canada.
The possibilities are endless and the expectations are through the ceiling.
Yes.
How does anybody meet those expectations?
Well, I think President-elect Obama has a really difficult job ahead of him.
You think?
In my most cynical moments, I say, a black man inherits the White House at the time that the U.S. nation-state is most imperiled. But yet, I think that given the enormous talent of this man, that we could possibly see one of the greatest U.S. presidencies of our time.
Now, I'm interested that you say that because I have seen, in fact, I think it was in the National Post yesterday or today, a guy named Theo Caldwell writes a column from time to time, and he said this is the least well-known man who has ever won the presidency, that he has run a spectacular campaign, but we actually know very little about his inner gut and what makes him tick. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't. I think, I've heard a number of different commentators and pundits make that claim. Here's a man who's been on the campaign trail for 22 months,
Oh, he's
almost
been vetted.
2 years.
He's been vetted. There's no doubt about that.
He's
But
written,
do you know him?
He's written 2 autobiographies. He's been given speech after speech. We know what makes the man. The man is tremendously disciplined. He's clearly well-read.
He's such a cool customer.
Yeah, he's clearly thoughtful. He knows how to build community. He knows how to reach out to people who have the expertise that he needs to engage with. What we've seen is, I think we've gotten a good example of how the man will govern, how he will run the White House. And I think we've gotten really good insight into what potential possibilities exist for a really great presidency.
Well, in which case, in our last 30 seconds here, tell us, what's a successful Obama presidency? What has to happen?
For me, it would be an interruption into the prison system in the U.S. and at least, if not full universal health care, moving in that direction. I think that those 2 things would be really important. And if I might add in my 30 seconds, I look forward to seeing, almost giddily look forward to seeing our own Prime Minister sitting down with a black President, Barack Obama, and explaining his early withdrawal from Afghanistan when Obama is going to pressure him to keep the troops there, and he knows that Canadians are not supportive of that war.
I'm with you. I'd love to be a fly on the wall of that
Exactly.
conversation. Rinaldo Walcott, good of you to visit us at TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me, Steve.